All right, so get ready, because today we're really going to dig into something wild, a potential fair housing violation in Baltimore. Someone sent us a case file, excerpts from a request for reconsideration, filed with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, and let me tell you, it's juicy. We're not just talking legalese here. This is about real people, a whole neighborhood trying to rebuild, and there's some pretty strong evidence of a pattern.
Absolutely. And, what's really fascinating about this case is that it revolves around programs that are supposed to make homes more affordable. But the question becomes, affordable for who, right?
Yeah.
We're diving into how this program, the Historic Tax Credit Program, meant for revitalizing communities, might have actually ended up impacting residents in different ways.
So let's head over to Baltimore's Station East neighborhood. That's where all this goes down. At the center of it all is Nicholas Miles, a homeowner who claims he got hit with a whole different set of rules, different treatment than some of his white and Asian neighbors. And we're not just talking about one-off thing either. This document points to a pattern across multiple areas.
Yeah, and in this case, understanding exactly how these programs were used is key. One important thing to pay attention to is the deed rider, which is basically a legal agreement attached to the Historic Tax Credit Program.
Okay, so imagine this. You're buying a car. Seems simple enough, right? But then the dealer throws in this curveball, says you can only drive this car on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That catch, that's kind of like a deed rider, it adds this whole condition to you owning the thing.
Perfect analogy. And according to this complaint, this deed rider, it wasn't applied fairly to everyone. Out of all the residents who signed the Historic Tax Credit Agreement, 10 white and Asian residents, they didn't have this deed rider on their homes at all. But you had 16 residents, 15 black, and 1 mixed race they did. And that's a pretty big difference right there.
Wow, yeah, that's a huge red flag for sure. And it's not just that the deed rider existed, it's how it was seemingly enforced or not that raises even more questions. This pattern, it pops up again with a lien from a company called Healthy Planet LLC. 2 white residents, they were reportedly released from this lien right at or even before closing on their homes, meaning they never even had to deal with it. But
6 black and mixed race residents were reportedly released after closing, which means they had to figure out they had this financial burden and then fight to get it taken care of. That difference in their experiences and the financial strain it might have put on them, it's definitely something to think about.
And here's where it gets even more messy, with the historic tax credits themselves. The complaint claims that while 3 white residents were able to keep their tax credits no problem, 4 black residents, including Nicholas Miles, they were sued. They were sued by HEBCAC, one of the organizations involved in this whole redevelopment, just for keeping their tax credits.
And this is where you really see the human impact of these claims. Imagine buying a home, thinking you're getting a fair deal, only to get slapped with a lawsuit, legal fees, and the stress of it all. Nicholas Miles had to hire a lawyer, go through mediation, even face the possibility of paying back a huge amount of money, all because of how this historic tax credit agreement was used, or at least that's what the complaint says.
It's crazy, right? And it doesn't stop there. The complaint says Nicholas Miles kept hitting roadblocks trying to get that deed rider removed from his property when he wanted to refinance his mortgage. At least 2 white residents, according to this document, they got released from the deed rider without even having to refinance, which makes this whole thing even more complicated.
This is what makes you wonder, were these differences really just because of race, or were there other things going on? While the complaint says it's hard to ignore the pattern, we do need to look at it from all sides.
You're totally right. Different perspectives are super important. And it's worth mentioning that the complaint also brings up construction issues. It claims Nicholas Miles and 6 other black residents faced delays and problems getting pre-settlement repairs done. Again, this is compared to the experiences of 14 white and Asian residents who supposedly had their construction problems taken care of much faster.
While construction delays can happen for a ton of reasons, these consistent differences highlighted in the complaint really make you want to take a closer look. It's about finding any potential patterns and figuring out if those patterns are pointing to a systemic issue.
Exactly. Connecting those dots is crucial. And speaking of patterns, there's this one little detail, I just got to mention it. It really shows the difference in treatment that's being alleged here.
Okay, I'm all ears. Sometimes those small details reveal a lot.
So the complaint states that a contractor working on Nicholas Miles's home accidentally broke a ceramic plate. These things happen, but instead of just replacing it or offering to fix it, a representative from HEBCAC supposedly told Nicholas Miles to just glue it back together himself.
They told him to glue it. Are you serious? That's a
Right.
wild detail. It really says something about how they approached addressing his concerns compared to maybe other residents.
Mhm.
It's like they didn't even think about taking responsibility for the contractor messing up.
Right. It just adds to the overall picture being painted here. Now, before we jump to conclusions, we need your expert take on this. Based on what we've seen so far, is there enough here to suggest a pattern of discrimination?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not one I can answer definitively without really getting into the legal framework, the evidence, and how HEBCAC and ESD respond. But I can say this, the complaint definitely raises some eyebrows, that's for sure. When we talk about proving there's a pattern of discrimination, we look for consistent, unequal treatment, and it has to be tied to something like race, something that can't be explained away easily.
So, like, if HEBCAC and ESD had just applied that deed rider to everyone, no matter their race, or if they had a clear reason for these differences that wasn't about discrimination, proving it was intentional would be way harder.
Exactly. But here's the thing that makes this tricky. The complaint claims that HEBCAC and ESD, they knew about these differences. It says they kept doing things even after they were told it might be discriminatory,
Yeah.
and that adds a whole other layer to it.
That's huge. If they knew and still did it, that changes things. So let's talk law for a sec. What can someone like Nicholas Miles actually do if they think they've been discriminated against in housing?
That's where the Fair Housing Act comes in. It's a big deal because it says you can't discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, family status, or disability. This means that if you treat someone differently in any part of housing, like lending, renting, selling, or even just providing services related to housing, based on those things, it's against the law.
So that could be like giving different loan terms, refusing to rent to someone, or even steering someone to a certain neighborhood because of their race. We've heard those stories before.
You're right, and those situations are similar to what's being said in this complaint, especially when you look at that deed rider, the lien release, and how those construction issues were dealt with.
So, from what we see in this request for reconsideration, could Nicholas Miles have a case under the Fair Housing Act?
It's definitely possible, but it comes down to the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights to investigate all of this and decide if there's enough to go forward with a formal complaint.
And I got to remember, we're only seeing one side of this. We haven't heard HEB, SECA, and ESD's side of the story yet.
Really important point. They might have explanations for these differences that we just don't know about. But even if these specific actions aren't seen as intentional discrimination, it makes you think about those bigger issues within housing, the systemic stuff that affects a lot of people.
And that's what always gets me about these deep dives. They make you look at the bigger picture. So even if this case is about individual claims, how could it shed light on something like systemic racism in housing?
That's such a good question. You see, even if no one was trying to treat people differently because of their race on purpose, just having these differences suggests there might be some bias or problems in how HEBCAC and ESD do things. And those problems can really hurt. Black and minority homeowners, it's like noticing cracks in the foundation.
That is so important. It's not always about proving someone was openly racist. Sometimes it's about seeing how policies, even ones that seem fine on the surface, can actually have unfair results.
I agree completely. Let's say HEBC and ESD didn't have clear rules for using that deed rider, or maybe they weren't good at communicating with Black and minority homeowners. Those things might seem neutral, but they can lead to discriminatory outcomes.
It makes you wonder how many other people are dealing with the same problems without even realizing it.
It does, and it shows how crucial fair housing laws are. Those enforcement agencies, like the MCCR, they're so important because they can step in and address these issues.
For sure. Now, before we move on, there are a couple more interesting things in this document I want to get to. You know I love a good twist in the story.
Oh, I know you do. What is it?
Well, this complaint has excerpts from HEBCAC board meetings. And let's just say some of the things board members said are, well, interesting.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more.
One board member apparently said they were worried HEBTech management wasn't treating Nicholas Miles with respect, implying he should just be happy to be living in one of these homes.
If that's true, that's a red flag. It's like they don't get what Nicholas Miles was going through, and there's this power imbalance.
Exactly. And another board member supposedly said that Nicholas Miles didn't complain about repairs until it was time to hand over the tax credit money, basically saying he wasn't being genuine.
Wow, seriously. If that's accurate, it sounds like HEBCAC might have been trying to make Nicholas Miles look bad instead of taking responsibility.
And get this. There's another comment from a different board member suggesting that Nicholas Miles, as a first-time homeowner, needed counseling after moving in to understand the difference between maintenance and a defect.
Oh, come on. That's just patronizing.
Ah.
It's that old stereotype of the minority homeowner who doesn't know anything about taking care of their place.
And it's even worse because the complaint shows that Nicholas Miles did try to get these repairs done the right way. He kept records, hired inspectors, tried to work with HEBCAC to fix things.
It really seems like they were trying to dismiss him and make it seem like his concerns weren't valid for the beginning.
Okay, and here's where things get really interesting, legally and ethically. So they sued Nicholas Miles for the tax credit money, right? But then HEBCAC said they'd drop the lawsuit and even help with some repairs, but there's a catch.
There's always a catch. What do they want?
They'd help, but only if you return the tax credit money anyway.
Are you kidding me? What were they thinking?
Right. It's like they were trying to find a solution and avoid a long legal fight, but it also feels like they were using their power to pressure Nicholas Miles into giving up something he had a legal right to.
Absolutely. It's like a lose-lose situation.
Mm-hmm.
He either takes the deal, gets the repairs, but loses money, or he fights for his rights and risks even more pushback. It shows how much power dynamics matter in these situations.
It's a tough call, and it doesn't end there. The complaint says even though HEBCAC dropped the lawsuit, they still made it hard for Nicholas Miles to get those repairs taken care of, almost like they were punishing him for not taking the deal.
Really? How so?
Well, it says they were slow to respond to him, kept questioning his contractors, and get this, they apparently told him they couldn't afford security patrols in the neighborhood because he hadn't given back the tax credit money.
Oh, wow. That's just wrong on so many levels. It's one thing to disagree about a contract, but it's another thing to punish someone for using their legal rights.
Right. It feels retaliatory, like a threat.
It makes you wonder what else is going on here, honestly.
There's definitely a lot to think about, but before we get ahead of ourselves, it's important to remember we're only seeing a small part of a much bigger story.
Absolutely. We're talking about allegations, not proven facts.
No.
And like always, we have to consider all sides.
We've heard a lot about what Nicholas Miles says happened, and we've talked about some potential red flags, but we got to acknowledge the elephant in the room here.
Yeah.
We haven't heard HEBCAC and ESD's side of things at all, right? And they might have perfectly good explanations for everything that could totally change how this whole thing looks.
Exactly. It's super important to stay objective, especially with something as sensitive as housing discrimination. Without hearing from both sides, we can't really say for sure if these claims are true or not.
Well said, and that's what makes this request for reconsideration so interesting. It's like one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and now it's up to the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. They have to investigate all of this, get evidence from everyone involved, and then decide if there's enough to move forward with a formal complaint.
Right. And, even if they don't end up finding enough evidence to say, okay, this was definitely discrimination, it doesn't mean the issues brought up aren't important. This whole situation just highlights the bigger problems that need fixing if we really want fair housing practices, not just in Baltimore, but everywhere.
Absolutely. This case, no matter how it ends, shows that we've still got a long way to go when it comes to fair housing, and that we all have a part to play in building communities that are actually equitable. It can't just be about laws, it's about holding people accountable and actually doing something.
100%. We need transparency, we need to hold organizations responsible, and there has to be a conversation happening between community groups, developers, and the people who actually live in these places. Everyone deserves a safe and affordable place to live, and it has to be fair.
So, what does this all mean for you listening? Well, if you're thinking about buying a home, especially in a neighborhood that's changing fast, or if you're using a program with tax credits or incentives, do your homework. Ask questions, don't be afraid to get into the details, and make sure you really get what you're signing up for before you sign anything.
And just as importantly, if you think you've been discriminated against when it comes to housing, don't stay quiet, talk to someone. Reach out to organizations like the MCCR or the Fair Housing Action Center. They can help you figure things out, support you, and make sure you know your rights. You're not in this alone.
This deep dive has definitely brought some serious stuff to light, but it's also gotten us thinking about fair housing in a different way, about those hidden problems and what we can do to create more equitable communities.
We've only scratched the surface here. If you want to learn more about this case or find resources about fair housing, check out our show notes. We've got links and extra info there.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been quite the ride, to say the least. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and let's all work towards a world where everyone has a real chance at a good home and a community where they can thrive.